The clinking of silverware, the low hum of polite laughter, and the rich aroma of roasted meat filled the dining room. It was a gathering meant to be ordinary, a ritual of companionship in a world where such rituals were rare. The table was long, polished to a soft glow by candlelight, and plates of steaming food sat untouched at their designated places. At first glance, it could have been any diplomatic dinner, any private affair where secrets hid beneath casual conversation. But on this night, there was a detail that would linger in history like a haunting whisper: one chair, still warm, though the man who had occupied it had vanished without a trace. The guests remembered him being there. They remembered his voice, calm, deliberate, carrying the cadence of someone used to speaking carefully. He had raised a glass, nodded politely, even allowed himself the smallest of smiles at a passing joke. Yet when the host turned his attention back to him, moments later, the man was gone. His plate sat untouched, his drink half full, but the chair beneath him carried the faint heat of a body that had been there only moments before. No one had seen him leave. No doors opened. No footsteps crossed the polished floor. And yet, somehow, he had disappeared. It would be easy to dismiss this as a trick of memory, a lapse in collective attention. But these were not ordinary people. This was not an ordinary man. He was a figure woven into the threads of the Cold War, a spy, a courier of secrets, a man whose true life could only be glimpsed through fragments of files and half-burned documents. Those seated at that table were not strangers to deceit, many of them lived lives that thrived on half-truths and quiet betrayals. And yet, even among them, his disappearance was something else entirely. Something that whispered of forces operating beyond comprehension. The police would be called. Statements would be taken. Every guest insisted they had not seen him leave. There was no quarrel, no sudden commotion, nothing that would suggest foul play in those critical minutes. And yet, the untouched plate, the glass without fingerprints, and the warm chair would come to define the case. To investigators, it was the perfect riddle: a man who existed 1 second and vanished the next, leaving behind only the ghostly reminder of his presence. For decades, the story would spiral into myth, retold in hushed tones across intelligence circles and conspiracy forums alike. Some claimed he had been executed on the spot, his body removed so swiftly and cleanly that no one noticed. Others believed he had staged the entire dinner, orchestrated his disappearance as a final act of defiance, or escape. And then there were those who whispered something darker, that he had been erased, not simply killed but removed from existence itself, as if he had never been there at all. But here is the one fact that makes this story impossible to dismiss as mere rumor: the chair. It was warm. Not lukewarm, not faintly touched by the residual heat of a cushion, but warm, as if a body had been there, breathing and alive, just seconds before. This detail would haunt the investigation, a symbol of presence without explanation, a reminder that what had occurred could not be neatly explained away. The chair remained warm while the man himself ceased to exist in the eyes of those who had shared dinner with him. That is where our story begins, with a dinner party, an untouched plate, a warm chair, and a man who vanished into the abyss of history. No farewell, no excuse, no chance to follow him into the night. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. And from that single, impossible moment, spiraled one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age, the case of the spy who disappeared during dinner. Before he was a mystery, before he became a ghost whispered about in intelligence files, he was a man. He had a name, though even that is contested. To his neighbors, he was a polite but distant figure who dressed impeccably, greeted them with a reserved nod, and lived in an apartment that always seemed too clean, too orderly. To his colleagues, he was a competent administrator, skilled with paperwork and figures, though never quite social enough to linger after office hours. But beneath the mask of normalcy, there existed another self, a courier of secrets, a man who lived in the shadows, serving powers that only occasionally revealed themselves to him. His childhood had been marked by absence. His father, a soldier who never returned from war, left him with a mother whose silence carried more weight than words. Friends remembered him as watchful, always listening, rarely laughing. A boy who seemed to understand that the world was not a place of innocence but of observation. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed the kind of patience most adults never achieved, a patience that would serve him well in a profession where waiting, listening, and disappearing into the background were essential tools. Officially, he worked as a cultural attaché, a position designed to appear harmless. His business card bore a title that suggested diplomacy, the exchange of ideas, and the building of bridges between nations. In truth, the role was a shield, one that allowed him to move quietly across borders, to attend events where whispers could be overheard, and to collect fragments of information that, when pieced together, formed the larger picture of global tension. He was not the kind of spy who carried a gun into dark alleys, he carried silence, memory, and the ability to leave no trace. Those who knew him personally described him in contradictions. He could be warm, but only in flashes, as though kindness cost him energy he did not have to spare. He smiled rarely, yet when he did, it carried an odd sincerity that made people trust him. He seemed to drink without ever becoming drunk, to listen without ever truly revealing himself. One woman who had once been close to him said he had the eyes of someone who was always already elsewhere. She meant it as a complaint, but in hindsight, it reads like prophecy. In his private life, he maintained small rituals that now seem weighted with meaning. He ate the same breakfast every morning, coffee, black, and a slice of bread with butter. He recorded his expenses with meticulous precision, down to the smallest coin. He kept a leather-bound notebook that contained no sensitive information, only fragments of thoughts, lines of poetry copied from books, and the occasional cryptic remark. One of these remarks, written only weeks before his disappearance, still unsettles those who have studied his case: every table is a stage, but some dinners are the final performance. What did he know? What did he fear? His colleagues noticed subtle changes in him during the weeks leading up to that fateful evening. He seemed distracted, pausing in the middle of sentences, looking over his shoulder more often than usual. He began arriving late to work, something uncharacteristic for a man who valued punctuality. At least once, he was seen in the company of a figure who could not be identified, a man with a scar along his jawline who never appeared again in any photograph or witness testimony. There are letters, too, ones recovered from his apartment after the disappearance. They are unsent, addressed only to initials, perhaps a lover or a confidant. In one, he writes, "I fear the dinner they have arranged. It will not be food that is served, but judgment. If I do not write again, know that I chose silence over betrayal." The handwriting is steady, deliberate, as though he wanted the message to endure. Investigators would later debate whether this was paranoia or a genuine warning he left behind. And then there is the diary. Not the leather notebook of poetry and fragments, but a smaller, plainer journal discovered tucked behind the lining of his suitcase. It contains schedules, coded references to meetings, and one striking entry dated the night before the disappearance. It reads simply, "Tomorrow, I attend the dinner. I will sit, I will smile, but I do not know if I will rise again." If this was a man who orchestrated his own vanishing, he did so with remarkable theatricality. If he was a victim, he seemed to anticipate his fate with chilling clarity. Either way, these words now haunt the narrative of his life, casting his final days in an eerie light that makes it impossible to separate truth from foreshadowing. Yet, despite all the fragments we have, letters, notebooks, witness accounts, he remains opaque. We can trace his footsteps, reconstruct his movements, speculate about his loyalties, but we cannot pierce the core of his identity. He was a man built on layers, diplomat on the surface, spy beneath, and something else deeper still, something even the agencies he served may never have understood. It is this enigma that makes his story so enduring. He was not a faceless operative lost to the machinery of history, he was a man who lived among others, who shook hands, who made eye contact, who carried his secrets into the spaces of everyday life. And then, one evening, he carried those secrets into a dinner from which he never returned. When investigators later pored over his belongings, one of them remarked, almost to himself, it's as if he had been rehearsing his disappearance his entire life. A chilling observation, but perhaps not an inaccurate one. For whether by fate, betrayal, or choice, his final act was to vanish in plain sight, leaving behind a plate of food untouched, a glass of wine half full, and the unbearable silence of a chair still warm. To understand how one man could vanish from a dinner table and become a legend, we must step back into the world that shaped him. His disappearance did not occur in isolation, it was born out of a time when paranoia seeped into every corridor of power, when whispers carried more weight than armies, and when truth itself became another weapon in the endless war of shadows. The Cold War was not just about nuclear arsenals and military standoffs, it was about secrets. Secrets guarded like treasure, traded like currency, and stolen like jewels under cover of darkness. Intelligence agencies flourished, swelling into sprawling bureaucracies that extended their reach into every corner of the globe. Behind the speeches of politicians and the banners of ideology, there existed a silent battlefield where spies were both soldiers and pawns, where loyalty was a mask that could be discarded at any moment. It was in this battlefield that our vanished man lived his double existence. To the outside world, the 1950s and 1960s appeared as an uneasy but stable standoff between East and West. But beneath the surface, a relentless war was fought in alleys, embassies, and hotel rooms. Spies met in smoky cafes, passing folded papers beneath newspapers. Defectors risked everything, stepping into the arms of rivals for promises of protection. Dead drops were left in hollowed-out trees and beneath loose cobblestones. And at the center of it all were men like him, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in function. Every nation relied on such men. Washington needed eyes in Berlin. Moscow needed ears in Paris. London needed hands in Vienna. Intelligence was the lifeblood of strategy, and even the smallest fragment, a name, a meeting, a date, could tilt the scales of power. Our spy was one of countless operatives, yet his case would prove different, not because of his rank or his assignments, but because of the manner in which his story ended, abruptly, inexplicably, and with a theatrical silence that defied explanation. The backdrop of his life was not simply politics but paranoia. Governments suspected their own citizens, agencies suspected their own agents, and spies suspected themselves. The concept of the double agent was no longer rare but expected. Every time information changed hands, the question lingered, was this truth, or was this bait? Was this man a loyal operative, or had he already sold his allegiance to the other side? The Cold War thrived on uncertainty, and uncertainty eroded trust until every handshake felt like a test, every dinner invitation like a trap. This climate explains why his disappearance at a dinner became so haunting. A meal, in diplomatic circles, was never just a meal. It was a theater of trust, a stage where enemies pretended to be friends, and where even a clink of glasses could mask suspicion. Food was shared, but information was the true currency exchanged. To vanish from such a setting was not merely a social oddity, it was a rupture in the unwritten rules of espionage etiquette. It suggested betrayal, violence, or something worse. Files uncovered years later show that the spy had been part of a network known internally as the Corridor. It was a chain of operatives who passed sensitive material from east to west through a route of intermediaries spanning multiple European cities. Each link in the chain knew only fragments, never the whole, which made it harder to betray the network, but also harder to know who could be trusted. Some historians believe his disappearance was the result of the corridor being compromised. Perhaps he had been exposed as a traitor. Or perhaps he had uncovered a traitor and was silenced before he could act. Whispers from defectors add fuel to the speculation. One former intelligence officer claimed that our vanished man had been marked for removal months before the dinner, his usefulness outweighed by the danger he posed. Another insisted he was about to defect himself, ready to hand over a cache of documents that would have exposed both sides' operations. Neither claim was ever verified, yet both fit neatly into the climate of betrayal that defined the era. Consider the telegram discovered hours before his disappearance. Sent from a location still disputed, it bore only a brief message: the dinner will decide everything. Was this a warning sent to him, or a command issued about him? Its origin was obscured by the labyrinth of Cold War communication, where false trails were often laid deliberately to confuse. Yet its timing cannot be ignored. The telegram suggests that his presence at that dinner was not chance but destiny, a culmination of forces aligning beyond his control. The Cold War was littered with vanishing men and women, swallowed by the machinery of espionage. Some were discovered decades later, living quietly under new identities in remote corners of the world. Others were found in shallow graves or unnamed prison cells. Many, however, were never found at all. Their absence became as potent as their presence once was. Our vanished man belongs to this last category, yet his case stands out because of the surreal details, the warm chair, the untouched plate, that refused to fade into the background of ordinary Cold War disappearances. Even now, intelligence historians argue whether his vanishing was an act of theater or a final silencing. Was he abducted in plain sight, removed so swiftly and cleanly that not even a room full of trained observers noticed? Was he complicit, excusing himself silently and slipping into a carefully staged escape plan? Or had the machinery of espionage perfected a method of erasing a man so completely that he ceased to exist, leaving only the echo of his presence behind? One thing is certain, his disappearance cannot be divorced from the paranoia of the era. It was an era when neighbors informed on neighbors, when mail was opened before it reached its destination, when hotel rooms buzzed faintly with hidden microphones. A man could be alive one moment and gone the next, and those who searched for him would be told nothing, or worse, told lies designed to mislead. In such an atmosphere, the vanishing of a single operative was not just an event, it was a message. The evening had begun like countless others in the world of diplomacy, an invitation extended, a guest list prepared, a dinner arranged to appear informal while carrying undertones of business and subtle negotiation. The house in which it was held was elegant but understated, a villa set back from the road, with ivy clinging to the walls and windows glowing warmly against the cool night. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the smallest sound, the turning of a key, the opening of a car door, seem amplified. Inside, however, the air was thick with conversation, laughter, and the comforting aroma of food prepared with deliberate care. The dining table stretched nearly the length of the room, polished so well that the candle flames flickered in its surface as though they burned twice. Place settings gleamed, porcelain plates, polished cutlery, glasses that caught the light in fractured rainbows. To an outsider, it would have seemed a scene of civility, of cultured men and women gathering to share a meal. But to those who lived in the world of intelligence, there was always another layer. Meals were masks, dinners were stages, and every gesture, every glance, could conceal meaning. Our vanished man arrived punctually, as was his habit. He wore a dark suit, crisp but unassuming, the kind of attire designed to draw no undue attention. Witnesses recalled how he greeted the host with a handshake that lingered a second too long, exchanged pleasantries with fellow guests, and took his seat at the table. His chair was positioned midway down the left side, giving him a clear view of both ends of the table. From that vantage, he could watch, listen, and, if necessary, disappear into observation. No one knew it would be the last time they would see him. The dinner began with soup, a rich consommé served in shallow bowls. Conversation was light, cautious, the way it often is before alcohol loosens tongues. Some guests spoke of theater performances, others of recent travels, all the while avoiding the heavier subjects that sat silently among them: politics, espionage, loyalty. Our man participated little. He nodded, offered a polite remark here and there, but seemed distracted, as if listening for something no one else could hear. By the second course, the tone had shifted. The wine had begun to flow, loosening the atmosphere, encouraging stories that hinted at politics without addressing them directly. One guest mentioned a new trade agreement, another referenced the shifting climate in a neighboring country. The vanished man lifted his glass but drank sparingly. One guest later recalled how he swirled the wine but rarely swallowed, as though reluctant to dull his senses. It was a small detail at the time, but it would later become a point of scrutiny. The minutes ticked by. A clock on the mantel chimed softly, though few seemed to notice. The third course was brought out, a roasted game bird, fragrant with herbs. Plates were set before each guest. It was then, witnesses agree, that something strange began to happen, not a commotion, not a disruption, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a draft entering an otherwise sealed room. Several guests would later claim they felt it, though they could not describe it. A tension, a presence, or perhaps an absence. At precisely this moment, one of the guests engaged him in conversation. They asked a question, trivial, about literature, about whether he had read a recent book circulating among intellectuals. He smiled faintly, leaned slightly forward as though preparing to answer, and then paused. Another guest interrupted, laughter filled the space, and attention shifted. When eyes returned to him, he was gone. What followed was confusion, though at first muted. In gatherings like these, people excuse themselves without announcing it. A man might rise to take a phone call, step into the hallway to smoke, or retreat to the restroom. No one thought it unusual, in those first few minutes, that he was absent from his chair. But then the minutes passed. The food before him remained untouched. His glass, half full, still caught the flicker of the candles. The chair, this detail emphasized by nearly every witness, remained warm, as though he had been seated only moments before. The host noticed first, his gaze falling to the untouched plate. He asked casually, "Has anyone seen him step out?" Heads turned, shrugs followed. A few assumed he was making a call. Another suggested he might have gone outside for air. But no sound had been heard, no footsteps across the creaking floorboards, no door opening, no draft from outside. The house was old enough that such noises would have been audible. Yet no one had noticed a thing. Curiosity shifted to unease. A search began, discreet at first so as not to alarm the gathering. A guest excused themselves, checked the hallway, the restroom, the kitchen. Nothing. Another peeked into the coatroom, expecting perhaps to see him adjusting his jacket or making a note in his small notebook. Again, nothing. His coat still hung neatly on its hook, his hat resting atop it. The silence grew heavier. When the host returned to the dining room, his expression confirmed what others had begun to suspect: the man was not in the house. A more formal search followed, this time with two guests combing the upstairs rooms, another checking the garden. The result was the same. It was as though he had vanished into air, leaving behind only the phantom trace of his presence. And yet, there were details that refused to align neatly. A servant swore they had heard the faint sound of footsteps near the kitchen, but when pressed, admitted it might have been someone else moving in the dining room. Another guest claimed they had seen a shadow near the doorway, though when asked to clarify, could not be certain whether it belonged to him or another. The accounts contradicted each other, blurring rather than clarifying the timeline. The most unsettling evidence remained his place at the table. The roasted bird on his plate was untouched, the silverware aligned precisely where it had been placed. His wineglass bore no fingerprints, as if it had been polished before being set down. The evening had started like any other. The clink of cutlery, the low hum of conversation, the faint jazz spilling from the corner of the dining room, it was the kind of atmosphere that lulled people into comfort, made them forget that outside the restaurant walls the world was tearing itself apart with war, espionage, and secrets no one dared to say aloud. The man at the center of it all, let us call him Daniel Roth for the sake of clarity, walked into the restaurant with a presence that was at once unassuming and commanding. He wore a dark suit that seemed intentionally ordinary, yet his posture, his measured steps, and the way his eyes scanned the room betrayed the discipline of someone trained to see what others missed. Daniel had reserved a table near the back. Not too close to the exits, too obvious for someone in his line of work, but also not deep enough to be cornered. He sat with his back to the wall, an old spy habit, so no one could approach from behind. His dinner companion, a colleague whose name would later appear in only the most obscure fragments of declassified files, joined him minutes later. Their conversation, though carried in hushed tones, was sharp and calculated. Witnesses later remembered snippets, the mention of a shipment, of coded documents, of the wrong people getting too close. Yet to the casual diner at the next table, it looked like nothing more than two men enjoying a meal. The waiter brought the first course. Daniel touched his fork but did not eat. His plate remained untouched, pristine as though frozen in time. He listened, he nodded, he occasionally smiled politely, but he never raised the food to his lips. It was as though he knew he wouldn't have the chance. His companion ate sparingly, but with less restraint, unaware, or perhaps too aware, of the invisible weight pressing down on their table. Then, at some point between the arrival of the second bottle of wine and the murmured laughter from a nearby couple celebrating an anniversary, something shifted. The details are fragmented, stitched together later from confused testimonies and partial reports. Daniel excused himself, perhaps to step outside for a cigarette, perhaps to make a call, perhaps for a reason no one could ever prove. He pushed his chair back, leaving the seat warm, the imprint of his presence still fresh, and walked away from the table. His companion expected him to return in minutes. But Daniel never came back. At first, no one thought much of it. People leave tables all the time, bathroom breaks, phone calls, a breath of fresh air. The waiter passed by, noted the untouched plate, and assumed the man would return shortly. But minutes turned to half an hour, and unease began to settle. His chair remained pulled out slightly, as though he had only just stood. His jacket was still draped neatly over the backrest, his briefcase tucked discreetly at his feet. It was as if Daniel had stepped into thin air, vanishing in the brief span of time it takes to refill a wineglass. The unease sharpened when his companion asked the staff if anyone had seen him. A waiter swore Daniel had headed toward the back hallway, the one leading to the side exit. But another claimed he saw him drift toward the main door. Someone else thought they glimpsed him speaking to a tall figure in a trench coat, though that account would later be dismissed as imagination. The security staff at the front door had no record of him leaving. The street outside was busy enough that one man could disappear into the crowd without raising alarm, but Daniel's absence quickly began to feel unnatural. When authorities were finally alerted, they treated it first as a minor incident. Maybe he had grown ill. Maybe he had been called away on urgent business. But when they found his belongings still at the table, his identification papers, his notes, even his wallet, alarm bells began to ring. For a man in his line of work, leaving behind such items was unthinkable. Every spy knew that possessions could betray secrets. Yet here they were, abandoned in plain sight. As the night wore on, theories multiplied. Some whispered of a kidnapping, carried out with such precision that no one in the crowded dining room noticed. Others believed he had staged his own disappearance, slipping away to escape debts or enemies we may never fully know. There were even rumors of betrayal, that Daniel had been turned, and this dinner was his final act before vanishing into the arms of another intelligence network. And yet, for all these possibilities, the most chilling detail remained, the warmth of his chair. The servers recalled it vividly, almost with a shudder. They cleared his untouched plate, noting how the chair still radiated heat, a phantom trace of the man who had sat there moments earlier. It was not the absence that unsettled them most, but the physical proof of presence, the undeniable fact that he had been there, solid and real, and then gone without explanation. In the days that followed, the restaurant became a shrine of sorts. Investigators combed through every inch. They examined the plates, the glasses, the cutlery, as if fingerprints and residue might reveal a truth hidden in the smallest details. They questioned every diner, every staff member, every passerby who might have glimpsed him. Yet the accounts contradicted one another, painting a kaleidoscope of confusion rather than clarity. Some swore they heard footsteps toward the alley, others insisted he vanished into the men's room and never came out. But no body, no trace, no evidence materialized. The disappearance became legend almost immediately. Newspapers picked up the story with sensational headlines, transforming a man into a myth overnight. "The spy who left his dinner untouched," one paper proclaimed, the word striking with cinematic drama. His face, until then barely known outside classified circles, was now splashed across front pages. The world speculated endlessly: was he silenced by enemies? Was he spirited away by his own agency? Or had he, in some act of ultimate defiance, chosen to erase himself from existence? Even more unsettling were the quiet whispers within intelligence communities. The investigation into Daniel Roth's disappearance began almost immediately, yet from its very first steps, it was like chasing smoke. Authorities descended upon the restaurant with the urgency of men who knew they were already late. The chairs were still neatly arranged, the plates removed, the conversations of other diners long since faded. Yet the air seemed charged, as if the walls themselves remembered what the people could not. The police began by retracing Daniel's last known movements. Witnesses were called in, their testimonies documented, though each account seemed to blur at the edges. A waiter claimed Daniel had asked for directions to the washroom but never returned. Another swore he had walked toward the back alley exit. A woman at the bar insisted she saw him speaking with a tall man in a hat near the coat stand. The descriptions conflicted so much that investigators wondered whether everyone had been watching the same man, or if Daniel had been skilled enough to appear in multiple places at once, weaving through perceptions like an illusionist. The immediate search yielded nothing. The back alley revealed no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks, no discarded belongings, no traces of blood. The front entrance had doormen who claimed no one matching his description had exited at the critical time. Yet the timeline was airtight. Daniel stood from his chair, stepped away from the table, and was never seen again. Somewhere between those 2 points, he had dissolved from reality. To complicate matters, Daniel's life itself was a tapestry of secrets. His official cover story, that of a cultural attaché, was unraveled quickly. His files, when pried open with the kind of hesitation one feels before lifting a coffin lid, revealed his true identity: a covert intelligence officer working deep in the shadow wars of the Cold War era. Suddenly, what had looked like an unusual disappearance became something more sinister, more deliberate. If Daniel had been an ordinary man, perhaps the explanations would be simple: foul play, personal escape, or an unfortunate accident. But Daniel was not ordinary. He carried in his mind information that entire nations would have killed to possess. The investigators combed through his personal belongings left at the restaurant. His wallet contained cash but no credit cards. His identification papers were real but subtly falsified, crafted to withstand casual scrutiny but not forensic examination. His briefcase contained nothing but mundane papers, yet the handwriting on one page seemed almost too deliberate, as though it were written for someone else to find. There were numbers, sequences of digits that appeared meaningless to most, but to trained eyes could have been a cipher. The discovery fueled speculation: had Daniel left clues behind intentionally, breadcrumbs for those clever enough to follow? Or were they planted to mislead, to send pursuers in circles while he slipped into the shadows? Attention turned next to his dinner companion. The man was interrogated for hours, but his answers were a study in evasion. He admitted they had discussed sensitive matters but claimed ignorance about Daniel's departure. He said Daniel appeared calm, even though his untouched food suggested unease. The companion insisted he had nothing to gain from Daniel's vanishing, but the investigators could not help but notice his nervous tics, his darting eyes, the way his hands trembled when recounting the night. Was it guilt, or fear of saying too much? His eventual release came not from lack of suspicion but from lack of evidence. Outside the restaurant, the trail grew colder still. Surveillance was in its infancy, and the few cameras in the area yielded nothing useful. Taxi drivers were questioned, but none recalled picking up a man who matched Daniel's description. A beggar near the corner claimed he saw 2 men pushing someone into a dark car, but his credibility was shredded under cross-examination. The city itself seemed to conspire in erasing Daniel Roth, swallowing him whole without a single trace. What made matters worse was the political climate. Intelligence agencies from multiple nations quickly took an interest. Some saw opportunity in his disappearance, whispering that Daniel might have defected. Others feared he had been abducted, his knowledge now being wrung out by enemy hands. Each theory carried terrifying implications. If he had switched sides, entire operations might be compromised. If he had been taken, lives across continents were suddenly in jeopardy. If he had staged his own vanishing, then perhaps a darker, more personal betrayal lay at the heart of it all. Investigators pursued leads that only deepened the fog. A hotel clerk swore Daniel had checked into a nearby room under a different name, but the signature was never verified, and the room itself yielded nothing but a made bed and an unused bathroom. A train ticket purchased the following morning in a neighboring city bore a faint resemblance to his handwriting, but it was inconclusive. At every turn, the truth seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only the outline of possibility. Weeks passed, and yet the disappearance refused to fade from public imagination. Newspapers fed on it, spinning theories more dramatic than the last. One headline declared him a ghost of the Cold War. Another asked if he had been swallowed by his own government to keep secrets buried forever. Radio hosts debated whether he was alive somewhere, staring at the same stars as the rest of the world, but locked in a cage of silence. But behind the media frenzy, the men who knew him best, his fellow agents, struggled with their own theories. They knew Daniel's discipline, his paranoia, his meticulous routines. He would never have left without a plan. If he disappeared, it was because he wanted to, or because someone with extraordinary resources had made him. The untouched plate at his dinner was not just a detail, it was a symbol of interruption, of a life paused mid-sentence. For those in his inner circle, it was almost like a signature, a final message left in plain sight: nothing ends cleanly, nothing resolves without residue. As time dragged on, the official inquiries slowed. Other crises demanded attention, other names replaced his in the headlines. Yet the mystery only grew sharper in its silence. Files on Daniel's case were quietly classified, buried in drawers where dust could guard them better than locks. But even as bureaucracy moved on, whispers lingered in alleyways and back rooms. A spy doesn't simply vanish at dinner. Something had happened that night, something invisible but monumental. Years later, fragments would surface, rumors of a man resembling Daniel spotted in foreign capitals, whispers of coded transmissions carrying his old signature, sightings that never held up to scrutiny. Each fragment gave birth to new theories, new obsessions. But none could answer the core enigma: how had a man walked away from a chair still warm, leaving a plate untouched, and vanished so completely that the earth itself seemed to conspire in keeping him hidden? And so the trail of Daniel Roth became less a path to follow and more a labyrinth to lose oneself in. Every turn promised revelation, yet every corridor ended in darkness. It was not just an investigation now, it was a haunting. His colleagues dreamed of him, his enemies cursed his name, and his family, bound by silence, lived with the hollow echo of absence. By the end of the first year, even the most diligent investigators admitted defeat. But none of them forgot the case. It clung to them like a shadow, a reminder that in the world of espionage, certainty is an illusion, and sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what you know, but what you never find. Still, buried in the wreckage of dead ends and unanswered questions was the faintest glimmer of something more. Hidden patterns in his papers, coincidences that felt deliberate, accounts that only made sense if pieced together in just the right order. Perhaps the trail had not gone cold at all. Perhaps it had simply been designed to look that way. And for those who dared to keep searching, that suspicion was both intoxicating and deadly. The search for answers in Daniel Roth's disappearance quickly shifted from chasing ghosts of his movements to interrogating the human figures who orbited his life. For investigators, the case became less about where Daniel had gone and more about who might have wanted him gone. In espionage, every absence is an accusation, every silence a potential betrayal. And the longer Daniel remained missing, the clearer it became that a web of suspects was tightening around his name. The first circle of inquiry was obvious: his fellow operatives. Men and women trained in the same craft as Daniel, many of whom had worked with him in the shadows. They understood his methods, his paranoia, his routines. To the investigators, it seemed possible, perhaps even likely, that one of them had helped orchestrate his vanishing. Spies do not simply disappear without assistance. Was it an inside job, an act of betrayal hidden under the veil of professionalism? Or had one of his own colleagues acted under orders they could never admit? Daniel's dinner companion remained the prime suspect. Though cleared officially for lack of evidence, he was never truly free from suspicion. Every gesture he made during the dinner was scrutinized in retrospect. Had his laughter been too forced? Had his insistence that Daniel seemed calm been rehearsed? Colleagues whispered behind closed doors that he had reason to resent Daniel, reason to see him gone. Some said Daniel had uncovered corruption within his own agency, others suggested he had been romantically entangled with someone his companion considered off-limits. These stories were unverified, perhaps exaggerated by gossip, but in the world of espionage, rumors often cut closer to the truth than official statements ever could. But suspicion did not stop with colleagues. Daniel had enemies, plenty of them. He had disrupted smuggling rings, infiltrated political networks, and undermined rival intelligence cells across Europe and beyond. Each mission completed had left scars on others, and many of those scars had festered into vendettas. For men like Daniel, survival was not just about staying hidden but about staying one step ahead of those who wished him erased. Was it possible that one of those enemies had found their moment at last, striking not on the battlefield of shadows but in the public intimacy of a dinner? One name kept resurfacing, a figure known only by the codename Marrow. A ghost within the intelligence community, Marrow was whispered to be a fixer, a man who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. His work was described with a kind of fearful reverence. No bodies. No evidence. Just an empty space where a person once existed. Investigators could never prove Marrow was real, but some files hinted that Daniel had crossed paths with him before. If so, the warm chair left behind at that restaurant may have been Marrow's signature, an act so clean it bordered on theatrical. Then there was the question of Daniel's personal life, which investigators hesitated to touch at first. Spies often cultivate personal myths, fragments of truth woven into layers of fiction. But as they peeled back the layers, they discovered cracks. Daniel had been married once, years before, to a woman who vanished from the record almost as cleanly as he later would. Some whispered that she, too, had been an agent, and that their separation had not been a matter of distance but betrayal. If she still lived, was she part of the story now? Some agents suggested bitterly that personal revenge was often more dangerous than political motives. A lover betrayed can be far more ruthless than an enemy assigned. The investigators compiled a list of potential suspects, fellow agents, foreign rivals, criminal organizations, shadowy figures like Marrow, even the ghost of a former wife. Each line of inquiry opened more doors than it closed. One week the focus was on an Eastern Bloc operative spotted near the restaurant days before Daniel's disappearance. The next week, attention shifted to a local smuggling network that Daniel had disrupted months earlier. Each lead felt promising at first, but always ended in frustration, as if the truth itself was deliberately hiding just out of reach. And yet, through it all, there was a darker suspicion, one that the investigators rarely spoke aloud but could never fully silence. What if Daniel himself was the architect of his disappearance? The untouched plate, the warm chair, the belongings left behind, it could all be read not as evidence of abduction, but as the staging of a vanishing act. Daniel was clever enough to leave false trails, disciplined enough to orchestrate his own erasure. If he had grown tired of the endless games of loyalty and betrayal, if he had decided to defect or simply vanish into obscurity, what better way than to walk away in plain sight, mid-dinner, and never return? This possibility unsettled his colleagues more than any enemy plot could. Betrayal from within strikes deeper than attack from without. If Daniel had defected, then every mission he had worked on, every secret he had carried, was now compromised. Lives were at risk, operations exposed. His absence was not just personal, it was catastrophic. Yet believing this meant accepting that a man they had trusted implicitly had been a traitor all along. Many refused to believe it. Others, more hardened, admitted that spies are trained to deceive everyone, including their friends. Investigators pressed further, and soon patterns began to emerge. Several witnesses from the restaurant remembered seeing a tall figure with strikingly pale hands, who seemed to linger near Daniel's table at intervals during the evening. This figure was never identified. Some thought it might have been a handler, checking on him. Others believed it was a stranger marking him for capture. The detail of the pale hands stuck in people's minds, though no one could explain why. Such fragments were maddening, details vivid enough to feel important, but too fragile to solidify into fact. Theories multiplied until they suffocated the case. Was Daniel taken by rivals, betrayed by allies, or swallowed by his own agency? Each theory made sense on its own, yet none explained everything. If it was enemies, why leave his belongings behind, unsearched, as if irrelevant? If it was allies, why not control the narrative with a cleaner cover story? If it was Daniel himself, why leave breadcrumbs that only deepened the mystery? Years later, when declassified documents offered glimpses into the investigation, the list of suspects read like a roll call of ghosts, colleagues who had since disappeared themselves, enemies long dead, figures whose existence was never more than rumor. The shadows multiplied, and with them, the haunting question, who, if anyone, truly held the thread of Daniel's fate? Yet perhaps the cruelest suspect of all was not a person but the machine of espionage itself. Spies are commodities, their value measured in secrets and lies. When a commodity becomes too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too expensive, it is disposed of. Could it be that Daniel had been erased not by an individual, but by the very system he had served? His disappearance, then, would not be an anomaly, but a grim inevitability. The investigators never named a definitive culprit. Officially, the file remained open, unresolved. Unofficially, each investigator carried their own private conviction, their own ghost of a suspect haunting them. Some believed in betrayal, others in abduction, a few in defection. None could prove their theory. None could rest. And so Daniel Roth remained what he had become the moment he stood from that dinner table, an absence that accused everyone, a shadow that darkened every corner. His chair had cooled long ago, but suspicion remained hot, burning in the hearts of those left behind. And in espionage, suspicion is often more dangerous than truth. Because somewhere, in the silence between fact and fiction, one suspect knew the answer. And that answer was worth more than any secret Daniel had ever carried. As weeks bled into months, the mystery of Daniel Roth's disappearance began to ripple outward, far beyond the city where he had last been seen. The unanswered questions refused to stay confined to one dining room, one investigation, or even one country. Whispers started moving across borders, through encrypted messages, intercepted phone calls, intercepted couriers, and the wary tongues of agents who knew too much and feared saying anything at all. Daniel's name became a kind of cipher in itself, a word that, when spoken, made people lower their voices and glance over their shoulders. For intelligence agencies, his absence was not just a local anomaly, it was a potential catastrophe. Daniel had been in possession of highly sensitive material, the kind that could alter political balances if it fell into the wrong hands. Some files suggested he was working on decoding communications between Eastern Bloc operatives. Others hinted he had been involved in exposing financial backchannels used to funnel money into clandestine operations. If Daniel had been silenced, it was likely because of what he knew, and who he might have been about to expose. The first international whispers came from across the channel. British intelligence intercepted chatter suggesting that a ghost operative had been spotted in London. A man resembling Daniel was seen near the Thames, wearing a hat pulled low, carrying a newspaper folded under his arm. But the report came secondhand, through the shaky memory of a surveillance officer who admitted he only saw the man for a few seconds before the figure disappeared into the underground. Still, the description was close enough to spark fear. Was Daniel alive and moving freely under a new identity, or had someone else been deliberately parading a lookalike to send a message? Meanwhile, in Paris, a different kind of rumor began. A contact deep inside a French intelligence office claimed Daniel had been brought to the city in secret, held in a safe house while officials decided whether to use him as leverage. The story seemed plausible, especially when combined with faint traces of financial records suggesting payments to anonymous accounts linked to Parisian banks. Yet nothing could be verified. Whenever investigators reached out, the trail dissolved into silence. In Moscow, however, the whispers were darker. Agents stationed there reported hearing that Daniel was dead, executed after interrogation, his body buried in a place that no one would ever find. The Soviet story claimed he had tried to defect but had been double-crossed, captured during his attempt, and disposed of like so many before him. To Western ears, this sounded like propaganda meant to demoralize. And yet, the possibility chilled those who knew him best. Daniel was not the kind of man to make mistakes lightly. If he had died in enemy hands, it meant the precision of his opponents had been flawless, and their silence intentional. Other whispers contradicted all of these accounts. A courier traveling between Istanbul and Beirut told his handlers he saw Daniel in a cafe, sipping strong coffee as if he had no worries in the world. A coded message intercepted in Berlin contained references that seemed eerily familiar, phrases Daniel had often used in his field reports. Was he still working, sending signals to those clever enough to recognize them? Or had his enemies learned his voice so well that they now used it to confuse and manipulate? The pattern was maddening. Every border seemed to generate its own Daniel Roth sighting, its own story of survival or death, defection or abduction. No two accounts agreed, yet none could be dismissed outright. In the world of espionage, lies often carry the seed of truth, and truths are often buried beneath layers of lies. Each whisper only deepened the fog, leaving investigators with a paradox: the more widely Daniel's name spread, the less certain anyone was of his fate. The international scope also brought new suspects into the light. Rival agencies had their motives, but so too did allies. Some speculated that Daniel had uncovered corruption not just among enemies, but within his own network, implicating powerful figures in financial fraud or political manipulation. If so, his disappearance might have been less about silencing a spy than protecting reputations in high places. Across Europe, doors that should have opened for investigators instead closed quietly, leaving them to wonder if the very people demanding answers were also ensuring they were never found. The whispers were not confined to governments and agents. Journalists, sensing a story too tantalizing to ignore, began chasing fragments across borders. One reporter claimed to have obtained a photograph of Daniel in Rome, though the image was too blurry to confirm anything. Another swore he had recordings of phone calls where Daniel's voice could be heard, though experts could never verify the authenticity. These claims, half-truths at best, only inflamed public fascination, making Daniel's case a kind of modern legend. To the public, he became both martyr and phantom, proof of the invisible wars fought in shadows that most citizens would never fully understand. Back home, far from the international corridors of espionage and the whispers that crossed borders, another silence was unfolding, one that carried a different kind of weight. Daniel Roth's family, bound not by intelligence reports or coded messages but by blood and memory, endured a vigil that seemed endless. For them, the mystery of his disappearance was not a chess game of strategy or politics. It was a wound that refused to close, a question that gnawed at them in the quiet hours of night, when the house felt too large and every creak of the floorboard seemed like an echo of absence. His wife, Eleanor, became the reluctant keeper of his ghost. She moved through their home with an air of careful preservation, as though afraid that disturbing anything might erase the last traces of him. His books remained on the shelf in the exact order he left them, his jacket hung neatly by the door, his desk untouched except for the faint layer of dust that time insisted upon. To outsiders, this looked like denial, a refusal to accept reality. But to Eleanor, it was defiance, her way of ensuring that, if Daniel returned, nothing would feel foreign, nothing would remind him of the years stolen in between. Their 2 children carried the absence differently. The older one, a son of 15, wrestled with quiet rage. He avoided questions about his father at school, often responding with clipped answers or silence. Yet, in private, he studied photographs of Daniel obsessively, memorizing the lines of his face as if repetition could summon him back. The younger child, a daughter barely 10, lived in a liminal space between understanding and innocence. At night, she whispered to her father's empty chair, telling him about her day, asking him when he would come home. To her, the silence was not yet final. Children often cling to hope long after adults have surrendered it. The family's home became a place of subtle rituals. Every evening, Eleanor lit a single candle by the window, a quiet beacon for a man who might never see it. Every Sunday, the children set the table for 4, even though the 4th chair remained unoccupied. These acts were not for practicality, they were for survival. To abandon them would feel like admitting defeat, and defeat was a luxury the Roth family could not bear. The community around them oscillated between sympathy and unease. At first, neighbors brought casseroles, offered prayers, and whispered promises of support. But as months stretched into years, compassion turned into awkwardness. People avoided Eleanor at the market, unsure what to say, afraid of reopening wounds that never closed. Even close friends began to falter, torn between loyalty and the exhausting weight of uncertainty. The Roths, once part of the fabric of their community, found themselves isolated, surrounded by people who cared but did not know how to act. For Eleanor, the hardest part was the not knowing. If Daniel had died, she could mourn. If he had betrayed them, she could rage. But the limbo left her suspended in both grief and denial, incapable of moving forward. She became intimately familiar with the cruel mechanics of hope, how it lifted in the morning when she convinced herself that today would bring news, only to shatter by nightfall when the silence endured. Hope became both her strength and her tormentor, feeding her with visions of reunion even as it starved her of closure. Every so often, official letters arrived. They bore seals of authority, stamped with the weight of bureaucracy. They offered updates that said nothing, assurances that felt hollow, phrases like ongoing investigation and classified information. Eleanor read them all, her eyes scanning for the slightest hidden clue, the faintest suggestion that Daniel was alive. But the letters, like the officials who delivered them, gave nothing of substance. They were smoke, designed to pacify rather than enlighten. The children, too, struggled under the silence of those letters. The son interpreted them as confirmation that his father was dead and that the government simply refused to admit it. His anger grew sharper, sometimes spilling over into arguments with his mother, whom he accused of clinging to delusions. The daughter, however, found comfort in the vague language. Ongoing investigation meant, to her, that her father was out there, waiting to be found. The words meant survival, even if only in imagination. Late at night, Eleanor often found herself replaying their last conversations. She remembered the way Daniel had smiled across the breakfast table, the way he had kissed her cheek before leaving, the way he had promised he would be home by the weekend. None of it suggested a man preparing to vanish. None of it hinted at betrayal. These memories became her anchor and her torment, for they painted a picture of normalcy that contrasted cruelly with the silence that followed. Friends urged her to move on, to rebuild her life, to consider the possibility that Daniel was gone forever. But moving on felt like a betrayal, not just of him but of the love they had built together. To close that chapter would be to accept that his story had ended, and Eleanor could not bring herself to write the conclusion. The years stretched on, and the case of Daniel Roth became less of an investigation and more of a legend. What had begun as a frantic search for a missing operative slowly transformed into a cultural phenomenon, a story retold in whispers, reshaped with every passing decade, and refracted through the lenses of politics, espionage, and folklore. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the perils of intelligence work; for others, it became a metaphor for the unseen battles waged in the shadows of history. His disappearance transcended the confines of his family's grief or the bureaucracy's endless files. It became myth. Journalists returned to the story again and again, each one certain they would uncover a hidden truth that had been missed. Some framed it as a tale of betrayal, painting Daniel as a man who had abandoned his family and his country in pursuit of freedom, or something darker. Others portrayed him as a tragic hero, silenced by forces too powerful to name. The versions of Daniel that emerged were as varied as the agendas of those who told them. Sometimes he was a victim, sometimes a villain, sometimes both. In truth, no one could say for certain. Theories multiplied with each retelling. One faction insisted he had been abducted, plucked from the dinner table in a swift operation by enemy agents. Another claimed he had never truly existed, that Daniel Roth was an alias, a fabrication used to conceal the identity of another operative whose cover had finally collapsed. Still others whispered that he had walked willingly into disappearance, vanishing not because he was taken but because he chose to erase himself from the world. Books were written, each claiming to be the definitive account. Some leaned on declassified documents, piecing together a mosaic of half-truths. Others relied on interviews with alleged insiders, former agents who spoke in riddles and contradictions. Conspiracy forums buzzed with speculation, UFO abductions, time travel experiments, parallel dimensions. Absurd as they were, these theories thrived in the vacuum left by official silence. When answers are withheld, the imagination rushes in to fill the void. But amid the noise, there were fragments, tiny details that kept the mystery anchored to something real. The untouched plate, the half-full glass, the warm chair. These tangible remnants refused to dissolve into fantasy. They reminded everyone that something extraordinary had happened on that night, something that resisted explanation but demanded belief. Even skeptics, who dismissed the wilder theories, struggled with those physical details. How could a man vanish without a trace while leaving behind such undeniable proof of his immediate presence? Governments, too, continued to play their part in the myth-making. Files remained sealed, testimonies redacted, timelines deliberately obscured. Each refusal to disclose fed the public's imagination, suggesting that what lay beneath the surface was too explosive, too destabilizing to reveal. In truth, the secrecy was likely born of embarrassment, incompetence, or bureaucratic inertia. But in the public mind, secrecy equaled importance, and importance equaled danger. The mystery thrived not despite the lack of answers, but because of it. Meanwhile, the family aged in the shadow of his absence. Eleanor grew old with the mystery still clinging to her, her candle by the window burning through decades of seasons. The children carried their father's ghost into adulthood, shaping their lives around questions that would never be answered. For them, the myth was no comfort, it was a prison. Each retelling in the press was another wound reopened, another reminder that their grief had been stolen and converted into spectacle. They were no longer just a family mourning a missing man, they were characters in a story they could not control. Historians would later argue that Daniel Roth's disappearance symbolized the paranoia of the Cold War era, a time when individuals could be swallowed whole by the machinery of espionage, their identities erased, their lives consumed by secrecy. Others argued it represented something timeless, humanity's fear of vanishing, of being forgotten, of being reduced to a question without an answer. To disappear is to surrender the narrative of your life, leaving others to write it for you. And Daniel's narrative was written, rewritten, and distorted until the man himself was almost unrecognizable. Yet even in myth, there was a haunting power. People returned to his story because it carried the weight of unresolved tension. It embodied the questions that never find answers, the mysteries that resist closure. His disappearance was not just about espionage or betrayal, it was about the fragility of presence, the ease with which a life can be undone. One moment of absence at a dinner table became an eternal reminder that certainty is an illusion. And so, the chair remained warm in memory, though the man who once sat there was long gone. The story endured because it was unfinished, and unfinished stories are the ones we cannot let go of. Daniel Roth's disappearance became more than an incident, it became a mirror. For spies, it reflected the risks of their shadowed world. For families, it reflected the ache of absence. For societies, it reflected the hunger for stories that both frighten and fascinate. The case file closed long ago. The dinner guests grew old and passed away. The house where it all began was sold, renovated, its dining room stripped of its original furniture. Yet still, somewhere in the collective imagination, that table exists exactly as it was on that night, plates full, glasses half empty, one chair warm, and a man who slipped into silence so complete that even time itself could not trace his steps. Because in the end, the story of Daniel Roth is not about how he lived, or even how he vanished. It is about what he left behind, a void, a silence, a mystery that refuses to die. And perhaps that is why, decades later, we still return to it, compelled to search for answers we know we will never find. His disappearance was not just an event, it was a haunting. And like all true hauntings, it does not fade. It lingers, waiting, reminding us that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones we never can.